Welcome to episode 4 of the Who Am I podcast with the Southside Church of Christ. I am Brian Dill.
I'm Jackson Wells.
And we are glad that you have decided to join us. We are glad that you are listening to this podcast, Who Am I? Maintaining our Christian identity amid the shifting sands of culture.
Yeah. As we kick off this week's episode, we should have done this one a week before because the topic that we're going with sort of lines up with something that we were experiencing last week, which was Martin Luther King Jr. Day. He was, by some people, viewed as a rebel. He was going against some societal norms that should not have been in place, and he changed the culture for some of the things we experience today, which is pretty awesome. So,
Right.
Rebels. My question for you, Brian, who is your favorite rebel?
To me, this is kind of an oxymoron of an idea. Your favorite rebel.
Yeah.
How do you pick someone like that? I've been thinking, and I'm going to go with Martin Luther.
Martin Luther. That's
the namesake of Martin Luther King.
There you go. That's a good one.
Martin Luther. We just passed a few years ago the 500-year anniversary.
Wow.
Of when he nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Catholic Church in Wittenberg, Germany.
Wow.
And so the thing to me about Luther is, on the one hand, he certainly stirred the pot.
Yeah.
But he did it in such a way that was not. He wasn't a troublemaker,
Right.
Because he nails up these 95 Theses. Well, even from the beginning, his idea was that this is something that needs to be a point of discussion.
Yeah.
This is something that we need to talk about in the universities and among the monks and all of that. But it didn't work out that way because of the reaction that he got.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, that's we could talk about rebellions. That could be its probably own series on the podcast. But like one of the things about rebel leaders, if you will, is a lot of times their intentions are good, but the reactions that they get are more violent in their direction.
Right.
Thinking about Martin Luther King Jr.,
Sure.
a lot of he went to prison and everything he did was quote unquote peaceful.
Right.
Right. I think about Rosa Parks and her. She wasn't causing anybody any trouble, yet she got sent to jail as well. It's just this idea of rebellion can sometimes be bad. And then
absolutely, and so someone like Martin Luther, he gets excommunicated and all of these things. But what I love about Martin Luther is he puts up these 95 Theses. He says this is something that we really need to investigate further. We need to talk further about what this is. And then 4 years later, my math's off today, I guess, in 1521 at the Edict of Worms, he is brought basically to trial, and he's told you must recant, you must turn away from what you have been writing and all these things. And I love what he says. He says, unless I am convinced of error by the testimony of Scripture or by manifest reasoning, I stand convinced by the Scriptures to what I have appealed, and my conscience is taken captive by God's word. I cannot and will not recant anything, for to act against our conscience is neither safe for us nor open to us. On this I take my stand, I can do no other.
that's pretty awesome.
That's bold.
Yeah.
Because he didn't know what might come of this, excommunication, he could be executed. Who knows?
It takes guts.
Yeah.
And something else that I think rebels with good intentions have it's this effect that they have on other people, because who is standing up to the Catholic Church?
Right.
Nobody. After Martin Luther, who was standing up to the church? a lot more people.
Many more, right.
And so sometimes it takes that first person to get it started to make a difference.
Right.
So Martin Luther, that's a good one. That's a really good one.
All right, so who's yours?
Well, I was talking to you earlier. A lot of the rebels that I looked up were not good people. They were Lee rebellions that were either violent or just not good. And so the person that I picked, not necessarily a great person, but is one of those copycats.
Okay.
In the 1600s, there was a guy named Thomas Tew, and he was the first pirate that we think of, the first modern pirate.
Okay.
And then after him, there were all kinds of pirates, and we know some of them in pop culture today. Probably the most famous is Blackbeard.
Right.
But this guy that I'm going to talk about briefly, his name is William Kidd. He was he was Scottish, fighting for England. He was in the Bahamas at one point, and he got captured by France. And so he took over he kind of led this rebellion on the French ship, took over the French ship, and then instead of fighting for England, he became a pirate. And so, like, I think pirate perfectly embellishes, like, rebellion. It's the person who's just like, I don't answer to any government. I don't answer to anybody. I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to get my own treasure. And if you get in my way, good luck. And so he was one of the most successful pirates, and then he retires. And so it's hard for a pirate to retire because they're typically wanted people.
Right. Sure.
It's either you die a pirate.
Okay.
So instead of getting killed, though, he actually gets hired by the English Navy to hunt pirates. And they're like, this couldn't be a better deal. I think the English were like, this is going to be perfect. This man knows what pirates think like. We're going to be able to hire him.
Right. Who better to know how to hunt a pirate than a pirate himself?
And then he turns on his contract.
Oh, good grief.
So he like has this chance to redeem himself, and then he rebels again. And then he ended up getting captured in 1699 and was executed in 1701 at the age of 56. Yeah. And I just, you could talk about any pirate as a rebel, I think. But, yeah.
So who's a 56-year-old pirate?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's getting on up there in age, I would think.
Yeah.
I wouldn't think that job lends itself to lengthy life.
No. Well, and that's what's crazy. Like, it's kind of like, if you do any reading in gangs, this is completely unrelated, but if you study like gang structure, like there's the guy on the bottom of the totem pole and they hardly get anything.
Right.
But the guy at the top gets everything. Yet, if you're anywhere on that totem pole, the risk is the same. Okay, and so, like, if you were the worst of the worst pirates who just got hired yesterday and you weren't making anything, if you got captured tomorrow, you were still going to get hanged. And so, like, it was a high risk, low reward kind of job. Right. If you got one ship captured, you might be good, but you can study on some pirates if that piques your interest.
And this was William Kidd.
William Kidd, yeah.
Not Billy the Kid.
Not Billy the Kid. Man, this is another thing. Billy Joel, my favorite musician of all time. He's got a song called Billy the Kid, and he talks about that. And at the end of that song, he's talking about himself, and he talks about Oyster Bay, which is one of the places that William Kidd, the pirate,
good grief,
like sailed into. So,
good grief.
Yeah. And then what's crazy about William Kidd's capture is all of the conspiracy that was going on. Like there was a Boston governor or a New York governor that was like, if I can capture William Kidd, I won't get in as much trouble because of all of the dealings I have done. And so, it's just like you've got all this evil going on, and but he was rebellious. William Kidd was rebellious at any given point, given the chance.
Well, in case you haven't guessed, our subject for today, or our question for today, is, am I a rebel? And I guess, depending on the context of that question, I think that a rebel could be seen as a positive thing or a negative thing. There are people who have rebelled in certain ways throughout history that have created good things. Martin Luther and Martin Luther King both being good examples of that. And then there's also the rebels that are creating problems for their culture or for a lot of other people. And then we have, fictional characters that are sometimes championed because of their rebelliousness, right? I mean, Jackson, you and I are both Star Wars fans, and the rebels, the Rebel Alliance, that's the good guys.
Yeah.
The evil empire is the bad guys, and then the ones who are trying to overturn that empire, that's the good guys. They're the rebels. And so it's kind of hard to know, do I want to be a rebel? Am I supposed to be a rebel? Should I be a rebel?
And then that's a whole we refer to in the Civil War the South. They were the rebellion. Typically, the rebellion is pushing away from the norm,
right?
And so you have to kind of ask yourself, well, is the norm good? And if the norm is bad, then we're rebelling against the norm is good. When it comes to the way we live as Christians, Matthew 5:9 says this: "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." A peacemaker is the complete opposite of someone who is a rebel, which in the end, a rebel's goal is for there to be peace. So I can see how, well, in order for me to make peace, I have to rebel. It's got to get worse before it gets better. But I don't think that if we look at Jesus' life, there was never a moment where peace wasn't the best option.
Right.
Even if it was submission. We always sing a song, "Could have called 10,000 angels," but man, let me tell you, that war would have been over before you know it, and humans would have been on the losing side.
That's right.
So what does it mean for us to be peacemakers as Christians? It's very important.
I think that's the challenge is the idea of being a peacemaker. Mm-hmm. There are certainly are passages where we're encouraged to be seeking peace, and that shows up a lot in Scripture. I think the idea of being a peacemaker is even more. There's an element of that. Rather than it's more active than passive.
I was going to say it's not just observe peace. It's a maker. You have to be doing something in order for that in order to achieve it.
Right. And I think the interesting thing to me about the idea of being a peacemaker is when you step back and think about the culture and the government under which most of these people lived in the first century, as a part of the Roman government, as a part of the Roman Empire. And yet, here they are as Christians who were rejected by the Jews, who were, depending on which exact time period, they were either ignored by the Roman Empire or they were persecuted by the Roman Empire, and yet they're told they're to seek peace. And sometimes I think we get it in our heads that Jesus's example in the temple is our excuse to not be a peacemaker.
Yeah.
As well, you look at what Jesus did there. Boy, that was not very peaceful. and that sounds like a really convenient excuse.
Yeah.
But most of the time when I hear that, I think, the next time you're as wise as Jesus, you are welcome to take those kinds of actions.
Yeah.
Because I think we are not equipped to have the kind of wisdom and distinction to know exactly when we can and can't take those kinds of actions.
And you think about the when, definitely, in that one, because if someone was trying to kill me, I would most certainly rebel. There was a time when that was happening to Jesus, and he let it happen, of course, for our salvation.
Right.
But you're exactly right. Whenever I have that wisdom, then never.
Right.
But yeah, it's definitely it's a challenge, and then being able to navigate that now, because, and I think this is what we're going to lead into, is it is so natural for us to not be peacemakers.
For sure.
It's easier to rebel sometimes than it is to I don't want to say compromise, but a lot of times that's what you have to do. And sometimes you have to just lose in order for there to be peace.
Right, right. And that's okay.
Yeah.
It's sometimes we have to be okay with being on the losing end. Why do you think this is such an important part of Scripture? Why do you think this is something that shows up so much as an emphasis for Christian living?
I think there are so many times where Jesus calls us to be different. And it is so natural for us as humans to rebel.
Okay.
And
right.
so if we are peaceful people, if we're making peace, we're going to look different.
That's for sure.
And it's going to make us stand out, and people are going to be like, well, what is the deal with those people?
Okay.
And it really will make us stand out. There's always this time in our, maybe not in everyone's lives, but there's a rebellious phase, or you're going to have this moment where you're going to stick it to the man.
Right.
But Jesus never has, he has those moments, but in peaceful ways. I'm going to go back to the Old Testament for a second. Jesus may or may not have made an appearance here. I was doing some research on it this week, and you can't really confirm. But I think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Okay.
Here are these guys who are captured. They're exiles. They're not in their homeland, and they're being forced to live a way that isn't conducive to their customs.
Right.
They're asked to bow to a statue, and they just don't do it. They're rebelling.
Yes.
At the risk of their own life.
For sure.
But they're doing it peacefully. They're not
right.
They're not trying to kill Nebuchadnezzar. They're doing their own thing peacefully. And I'm so glad that we have that text, because it just shows God's power and their peaceful action. Yes, they get thrown into the furnace. The furnace. There was a fourth guy that showed up in there. Was that Jesus? I don't know. But after that, they get taken out of the furnace, and Nebuchadnezzar's like, okay, I believe in your God now.
Right.
And anybody that doesn't is going to get their arms and legs torn off.
I mean, it's such a powerful thing that they did.
Yeah. Right? To stand up to an oppressive government, to risk your life for something, which doesn't seem very peaceful, but they were doing it peacefully. And then God's glory is shown after that.
Right, right.
And I think that is where humans, we don't think that far ahead. We don't think, well, I need to react now. That way I'm okay. That way I'm saved.
Sure.
But if we kind of step back, okay, what's the more peaceful option? And then also think, well, how is God's glory going to be shown in this? A lot more difference can be made.
Right.
And
I love that example. I think that is a great example of how we can see the difference between a peacemaker in the midst of a rebellion and what would have not been a peacemaker in the midst of a rebellion. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego weren't going around trying to find ways to overthrow Nebuchadnezzar and the government. They were simply just not going to bow to that idol. And there's so much more that they could have done that they didn't do.
Yeah.
And
it was a let go, let God, which is very cheesy, but it was a let go, let God kind of moment.
Absolutely. And I think that's kind of how we should approach this idea of being a peacemaker. And I think one of the passages that I think is really, really important in understanding the importance of being a peacemaker is in Galatians 5, but it's not what you would expect. It's not a passage that you would expect, because actually what's happening here in these verses is it's right before the fruit of the Spirit. And before the fruit of the Spirit list, love, joy, peace, patience, all that, we have the works of the flesh.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some terrible things listed here: sexual immorality, impurity, idolatry, sorcery.
Mm-hmm.
So some evil things in here. And right in the middle of that, in Galatians 5 and verse 20, some of the things that are listed are rivalries, dissensions, divisions. And I think, boy, that's really interesting to me, that here, alongside sorcery and idolatry, is divisions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes we forget how seriously God takes the need for peace amongst his people. And if we are creating division, boy, that's not okay with God. And I think that it has everything to do with our attitude. You know, there's a way to say, you know, I'm not sure I agree with this, and let's have a discussion about it. You know, nailing up the 95 Theses, you know, something like that. Here's some things that I think we need to discuss and study more carefully that are not necessarily creating division and dissension and undermining leaders and doing those kinds of things. You know, again, going back to your example with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they simply refused to do what was wrong. They didn't make a big stink about it. They didn't try to get some of the soldiers or something to get on their side and try to run some kind of military coup or something. They didn't throw a fit. You know, they didn't try to draw more attention to themselves by throwing a fit and saying, you know, tearing their clothes and throwing dust up in the air. I keep thinking about the way the Jews did things with Paul and Jesus. But they didn't do those kinds of things. They just simply did not bow. And so it's such a difficult thing sometimes for people, it seems, in our culture to be peacemakers.
Yeah. Well, we've got to be right.
Right.
So many times. And a lot of times we just need to accept that we aren't and admit that we're wrong. And
right.
Sometimes, like I said, sometimes at the beginning, it's powerful to say that you're wrong, because peace can come right out of that moment.
Absolutely. And you know, sometimes I think we have to also be willing to say that it's okay that we disagree on some things.
Yeah.
And I think that we have gotten to a point in our culture where somehow we've convinced ourselves that we can't disagree.
Yeah.
Or that you disagreeing with me means you hate me. And so I have to react to it as though you're saying that you hate me and everything about me. And so then there's this immediate knee-jerk overreaction. And man, that's not peacemakers.
It's not. And I think about the Civil War a lot when I think about rebellion. And there was a time during the Civil War where there was a presidential election in the Union, Abraham Lincoln versus this guy named McClellan. And McClellan was going to run on a different platform that potentially could have beat Abraham Lincoln. But he realized that in order for there to be peace, there needed to be unity. And Abraham Lincoln ended up winning in this crazy, massive landslide because McClellan kind of just was like, it needs to be you. I disagree with you, Abraham Lincoln, but I realize that in order for us to have peace over here, anyways, this is the way it needs to go.
Interesting.
And which is, I think, a lot of people need to be reminded that they don't realize how powerful they are, and admitting to making those decisions at the expense of yourself is better for a lot of other people.
Right. Right.
And that's human side of it. As Christians, we should be making those decisions for not the well-being of ourselves, our human self, but for our own salvation and for the salvation of others.
Right. That's great. That's great. Well, is there any other thoughts that you have? Had anything else?
I don't have anything else. In the thought of the most well-remembered rebels, as you go forward this week, may the force be with you.
Right.
But try to find peaceful options. If there is a conflict, ask yourself, okay, is what I'm doing creating more conflict, or am I seeking the more peaceful option?
Absolutely.
I think that would be a good challenge for anybody to have and try.
Right. And remember that as Christians, our identity includes that of being a peacemaker. Mm-hmm. We hope that this episode has been useful to you, and we look forward to seeing you or hearing from you sometime soon. God bless, and have a great week.